The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the framed photo of our wedding day. That day felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who still believed in the unshakable bond of love. I ran a hand through my hair, my fingers trembling slightly, and glanced at the clock. 9 a.m. Ella was at work, or so she said. Ella and I had been married for 8 years. She worked as a front desk manager at the Grand Crest Hotel, a place that always made her eyes light up with tales of luxury and sophistication. I admired her drive, her energy, but over the past few months, her job had become a shadow between us. Late nights, missed calls, and a growing distance that felt like an abyss. A week ago, I found a red scarf in her car, something I didn't recognize. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it belonged to a coworker who had left it during a carpool. The explanation seemed harmless enough, but something about the way she avoided my gaze that day struck me. Last night, though, was when the dam broke. She came home late again, the scent of an unfamiliar cologne clinging to her clothes. Her excuses felt rehearsed, and I couldn't help but press her. Ella, what's going on? This isn't you. You're barely here anymore. Her response was cold, distant. Peter, I don't need an interrogation every time I come home late. My job is demanding. You know that. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the woman I fell in love with still cared about the life we built. But the tension between us had been growing like a crack in a mirror. Each argument, each excuse, splitting us further apart. This morning, I decided to do something I never thought I'd have to. I checked her phone while she was in the shower. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages. And there it was, a name I didn't recognize. Messages full of casual intimacy and plans for meetups. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing. The air left my lungs. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but I couldn't move. My hands turned clammy, my chest tight. She was seeing someone from the hotel, based on the context of their chats. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The front door opened suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. Ella walked in, her smile forced, her eyes scanning me cautiously. You're up early, she said, dropping her bag by the door. I stood up, gripping the table's edge for support. We need to talk. Her face fell, the cheerful mask vanishing. Peter, what's this about? You're acting paranoid. I pulled her phone from my pocket and tossed it on the table. Who is he, Ella? The guy you've been texting? The one you couldn't wait to see again? For a moment, her face betrayed her. Shock, fear, guilt, all flickering across her features before she composed herself. You went through my phone? She said, her voice rising in anger. Don't twist this around, I snapped. You've been lying to me. I deserve the truth. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the floor. His name is Ian. He works at the hotel. Her voice was barely above a whisper. My heart felt like it was being ripped from my chest. How long? She hesitated, then said, a few months. The room spun. Months. Months of betrayal, of looking me in the eye and pretending everything was fine. Why, Ella? What did I do to deserve this? Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't move me. It wasn't supposed to happen. Peter, I didn't mean to hurt you. But she did. She shattered me. And as I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, I realized the life we built was no longer ours. It was a broken reflection of what could have been. The silence after Ella's confession was deafening. I didn't know what to say, how to act. My world had collapsed in the span of a single conversation, and the woman I'd built my life around stood there looking small, like she was the victim. I left the house. I had to. The walls felt like they were closing in. Hours later, I sat in my truck, parked at the edge of Greenhill Park, our kids' favorite place to play when they were younger. It used to be my sanctuary, a place to think or find peace. Now, it was just a space to be away from her, away from the lies. Her face kept flashing in my mind. The way she flinched when I confronted her, the tremor in her voice as she said his name. Ian, a guy I didn't even know existed until this morning, yet he had taken up space in my life, invaded it like a thief. I didn't go home until late that night. Ella was asleep, or pretending to be. The house was dark, quiet. I sat on the couch, not bothering to turn on the lights. I stared into the blackness, thinking about what came next. Divorce? Therapy? Could I even look at her the same way again? The next morning, I was still on the couch, the weight of sleepless hours pressing down on me. Ella left for work without a word. I didn't stop her. What was there to say? The doorbell rang mid-morning. My chest tightened. We rarely had visitors. I approached cautiously, peeking through the curtain. A man stood on the porch, tall and lean, wearing a tailored suit that looked a little too polished for our quiet suburban neighborhood. I opened the door, and he flashed me a sheepish grin. "Hi, you must be Peter." The confidence in his tone made my blood boil. "Who are you?" "Ian," he said, his grin fading as if he realized he'd miscalculated my reaction. I wanted to talk. I didn't let him finish. My hand shot forward, shoving him back a step. "Get off my property." My voice was low, but it carried enough anger to make him hesitate. "Listen," he said, raising his hands as if to pacify me. "I know this is. I don't care what you think you know." My voice cracked under the pressure of rage building in my chest. "You come to my house, after what you've done?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," he stammered. "Ella and I." I lunged toward him, and he stumbled back another step, nearly tripping over the welcome mat. "Don't say her name. You don't get to talk about her, or what you did to my marriage." He straightened, trying to regain some of that arrogant composure. "I thought you'd want to hear my side of things." "Your side?" I laughed bitterly. "Your side doesn't matter. You're a coward who had an affair with a married woman. What could you possibly say to make that better?" Ian's face tightened. "You should know she's not happy. She hasn't been for a long time. Maybe if you'd been paying attention." That did it. My fist connected with his jaw before I even realized what I was doing. He staggered backward, clutching his face. "You don't talk about my marriage like you understand it," I growled. He looked at me, his hand still on his face, a flash of fear in his eyes. "This isn't over," he muttered, stepping off the porch. "Yes, it is," I said, slamming the door behind him. My chest heaved as I leaned against it, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, waiting to see if he'd try coming back. He didn't. When Ella returned that evening, she found me in the kitchen. I hadn't planned on saying anything, but the moment she walked through the door, I couldn't hold it in. "Ian came to the house today." Her face went pale. "What? Why?" "You tell me," I said, crossing my arms. He seemed pretty comfortable showing up uninvited. Ella set her bag down, her hands shaking. I didn't know he would do that. I told him it was over." "You told him it was over?" I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. "Why does he think he can just show up here, Ella?" She didn't answer, her silence saying more than any words could. And just like that, whatever fragile thread of trust might have been left between us snapped. Ella sat at the dining table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I stood across from her, gripping the back of a chair, trying to keep myself steady. The silence between us stretched so thin, I was sure it would break like glass. "Talk," I finally said, my voice low but sharp. Her lips trembled, and she avoided my eyes. "Peter, I didn't know he'd come here. I haven't spoken to him since I told him it was over." "Since you told him it was over," I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. "When was that, Ella? Was it before or after you decided to sleep with him?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Please don't." "Don't what? Don't make you uncomfortable? You were plenty comfortable sneaking around with him while I was at home, taking care of everything." My voice rose with every word until it echoed off the walls. Ella stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You don't understand. It wasn't just about him. It was about me. I felt invisible. Peter, you're always so focused on being the perfect provider, the perfect husband, but it felt like there was nothing left for me." "Invisible?" I let out a hollow laugh. "Do you know how hard I've worked to keep this house running while you work those late shifts? Do you know how much I've sacrificed to make sure you were happy?" Her eyes brimmed with tears. "I know, and that's why I hate myself for this. But I was suffocating, Peter. I didn't plan for this to happen. It happened. Those words, it just happened. made my blood boil. As if infidelity was some accident she'd stumbled into. As if it hadn't been a series of deliberate choices to lie, to betray, to destroy everything we built together. "Don't give me that," I said, my voice cold. "You didn't trip and fall into his arms, Ella. You made choices. You lied to me. And now Ian thinks he has the right to show up at my house like he owns a piece of my life." She sat down again, burying her face in her hands. "I never wanted to hurt you. But you did. You've shattered us, Ella. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." We sat there, the weight of her betrayal filling the room like a storm cloud. I thought about the early days of our marriage, when she was my best friend, my partner in everything. I thought about the promises we made, the plans for the future we used to talk about late at night. And now, here we were, strangers who shared a house but not a life. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice muffled through her hands. I hesitated, my anger giving way to the crushing weight of uncertainty. What had happened now? Part of me wanted to throw her out, to never see her face again. But another part, the part that had loved her for so many years, was desperate to cling to what little we had left. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I do know one thing. You need to leave. Tonight." She looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Peter, please. Don't." I cut her off. "Go to a friend's place, a hotel, wherever. I can't look at you right now. I need space to think." Her lip quivered, but she nodded. "Okay." Ella packed a bag in silence while I sat in the living room, staring at the blank television screen. When she walked to the door, she paused, turning back to me. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't respond. As the door closed behind her, the silence in the house became unbearable. I thought it would bring me peace, but instead, it amplified the ache in my chest. This was my house, our house, and now it felt like a hollow shell. I sat there for hours, going over everything she'd said, replaying her words until they blurred together. Invisible, suffocating. It wasn't enough to justify what she'd done, but it left me wondering, had I failed her, too? Somewhere deep down, I still loved her. But love didn't feel like enough anymore. The next morning, the emptiness of the house settled over me like a suffocating fog. It wasn't just the absence of Ella's voice or her presence. It was the absence of everything I thought we were. The wedding photos on the wall, the memories etched into the corners of every room, they all felt like a lie now. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker as it bubbled and steamed, but I didn't pour myself a cup. It felt pointless, like everything else. I hadn't slept much, if at all. My mind kept circling the same questions. How could she betray me? What had I done wrong? Could I have prevented it? Over and over, the same storm of doubt and anger churned in my chest until I felt hollow. I tried to distract myself by tackling the little chores I'd neglected, fixing the squeaky cabinet, replacing the dead light bulb in the hallway, but none of it filled the void. Instead, each task reminded me of all the things I'd done for Ella over the years, and I wondered if she ever noticed, if she ever cared. By mid-afternoon, I found myself sitting at the dining table, staring at my phone. Her number was on the screen. Part of me wanted to call, to demand more answers, to lash out. But another part, the tired, defeated part, wanted to hear her voice, to feel like there was still something human left between us. I put the phone down, disgusted with myself for even entertaining the thought. That's when the knock at the door startled me. My first thought was that it was Ella, but when I opened the door, I found Ian standing there again. His face was bruised where my fist had connected the day before, but this time he looked less smug, more desperate. "What do you want?" I said, my voice flat. I came to apologize," he said, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I stared at him, incredulous. "Apologize? You think that's going to fix this?" "No," he admitted, shifting uncomfortably, "but I couldn't just leave things the way they were. I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you, and Ella," and he trailed off, glancing down at the ground. "Why are you really here?" I demanded. "You've got your apology out of the way. What's the real reason?" He hesitated, then looked me in the eye. "Ella's been calling me. She doesn't know where else to go." Something inside me snapped. You think I care where she goes? You think I'm going to pity either of you after what you've done? I'm not asking for your pity, he said quickly. I just thought you should know. Get off my porch, I said, stepping forward, my fists clenched. Ian didn't argue this time. He turned and walked away, leaving me seething. When I closed the door, I leaned against it, my breath coming in short bursts. Ella's actions had already fractured my world, but Ian's visit made something clear. This wasn't going to be as simple as cutting her out of my life. There were deeper cracks beneath the surface, ones that wouldn't be easy to repair. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The house felt colder that evening. I couldn't tell if it was because I'd barely moved all day, or because the life that once filled this space had been drained from it. The steady hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, and I found myself longing for noise, any noise. Even Ella's footsteps on the stairs, or the clinking of her keys in the bowl by the door. But she wasn't coming back tonight. I sat on the couch, staring at the TV. It wasn't on, and I had no intention of turning it on. I didn't know what to do with myself, how to break out of the numbness that had settled over me like a heavy fog. My thoughts drifted, unbidden, back to Ella and Ian, to her confession, to his smug face on my porch. The memory of my fist connecting with his jaw gave me fleeting satisfaction, but it didn't last. This wasn't who I was. The sound of a knock at the door jolted me from my spiraling thoughts. My heart leaped for a moment before I scolded myself for thinking it could be her. Still, I approached the door cautiously, half expecting Ian to have the audacity to show up again. But it wasn't Ian. Standing there was my brother, Matt, his face etched with concern. He held a six-pack of beer in one hand and a takeout bag in the other. "Hey," he said, offering me a lopsided smile. "Thought you could use some company." I didn't say anything, just stepped aside to let him in. Matt set the food on the kitchen counter and handed me a beer. "Ella called me," he said, cutting straight to the point. "She didn't tell me much, just that things weren't good between you two." "That's one way to put it," I said bitterly, twisting the cap off the bottle. He leaned against the counter, studying me. "Want to tell me what happened?" "No," I said quickly, but the word tasted sour. Keeping everything inside wasn't helping, but saying it out loud felt like admitting it was real. Matt didn't push. He just waited, sipping his beer, his silence patient but expectant. After a long moment, I gave in. I told him everything. Her late nights, the texts, Ian showing up here. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling, and the beer bottle felt like it might shatter in my grip. Matt exhaled slowly, setting his bottle down. "I'm sorry, man. That's a lot." I nodded, unable to find words. "You know what you have to do, though, right?" he said, his voice steady. "You can't keep living like this. You deserve better." His words hit me like a jolt. I'd been so caught up in the betrayal, the anger, the questions, that I hadn't thought about what I deserved. "Maybe," I said quietly. Matt clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Not maybe. Definitely." And for the first time in days, I felt a spark of something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. After Matt left, his words stayed with me, echoing in the quiet of the house. "You can't keep living like this. You deserve better." They were simple words, but they struck a chord deep inside me. For the first time since Ella's confession, I allowed myself to consider what moving forward might actually look like. Not as a vague idea, but as a real, actionable thing. The thought was terrifying. The next morning, I woke early, though the restless night hadn't done me any favors. I found myself in the garage, pacing aimlessly. The space was cluttered with things we rarely used. Holiday decorations, forgotten tools, and boxes labeled with scrawled Sharpie from the last time we'd moved. My eyes landed on one of the boxes marked memories. I hesitated, then pulled it down. Inside were old photo albums, keepsakes from trips we'd taken, and mementos of a life that now felt foreign. I flipped through the photos, pausing on one from our honeymoon. We were standing on the edge of a rocky cliff overlooking the ocean, her arms wrapped around me, her smile wide and unguarded. I remembered how she'd laughed when the wind messed up her hair, how she'd insisted on taking a dozen photos to get the perfect one. It felt like I was looking at someone else entirely. I shoved the box aside, unable to stomach more of it. I needed to get out of the house. The walls were closing in again, and the memories felt suffocating. Grabbing my keys, I headed to the gym. Exercise had always been my escape, but lately, I'd neglected it. My body had started to reflect the weight of everything I'd been carrying emotionally. The gym was nearly empty when I arrived, which suited me fine. I jumped on the treadmill, headphones in, music blasting to drown out my thoughts. Running felt like freedom, like control, two things that had been missing from my life for far too long. As the miles ticked by, the fog in my mind began to lift. The rhythm of my feet hitting the belt, the steady thrum of my heart, the sweat dripping down my back. It all reminded me of what I could still have. Strength, focus, a life that wasn't defined by her betrayal. When I left the gym, my muscles were sore, but my mind was clearer than it had been in days. I stopped by a coffee shop on the way home, something I hadn't done in years. As I sipped my drink, I took a moment to watch the world go by. People coming and going, living their lives. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. Back at home, I made a decision. I pulled out my laptop and started researching lawyers. It was time to stop waiting for Ella to decide what she wanted and start taking control of my own life. The first step was small, but it felt monumental. The lawyer's office smelled like polished wood and faintly of coffee. It wasn't the intimidating place I'd envisioned. No towering bookshelves crammed with legal tomes, no bustling assistants ferrying files back and forth. It was quiet, orderly, almost calming. Jeffrey Martin, the attorney I'd found through a friend of Matt's, was an older man with silver hair and a measured demeanor. His calmness was unsettling at first, but as we talked, I found myself trusting him. "So, what are you hoping to accomplish?" he asked, folding his hands on the desk. I hesitated, the enormity of my decision crashing over me again. "I don't know," I admitted. "I just know I can't live like this anymore." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Divorce is a big step. It's not just about separating assets or signing papers. It's about deciding how you want to move forward with your life. Are you ready for that?" I wasn't sure how to answer. Was I ready? I didn't feel ready, but I also couldn't imagine staying in this limbo. "Let's start simple," he continued, pulling out a notepad. "Tell me about your situation." So, I told him everything. The affair, Ian's visits, the way Ella had twisted our life together into something unrecognizable. As I spoke, I felt the weight of it lifting, like I was finally sharing a burden I'd carried alone for too long. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Well, Peter, you've got options. If the affair is well documented, and from what you've said, Ian's visits can be corroborated, that could work in your favor during proceedings, especially if there are financial entanglements." That word, entanglements, hung in the air. Something about it made my gut churn. "Financial entanglements?" I asked, leaning forward. "Has she been using joint funds in any way related to the affair? Paying for hotels, gifts, anything like that?" The thought hadn't crossed my mind. Ella handled most of the day-to-day expenses, while I managed the larger household accounts. I trusted her with that, or at least I used to. Now, doubt crept in like a shadow. Jeffrey must have noticed my expression. "It's worth looking into," he said gently. "If there's a pattern of spending tied to the affair, it strengthens your case." I left the office with a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, and a renewed determination to take back control. That evening, I sat down with the stack of bank statements I'd pulled from the filing cabinet. At first, everything seemed normal. Grocery bills, utility payments, the usual. But then I noticed something strange. A series of charges to a high-end restaurant downtown, one we'd never been to. Hotel bookings at places I'd never heard of. And the most damning, a purchase at a jewelry store last month. My hands shook as I traced the pattern, each transaction filling in the blanks of Ella's betrayal. It wasn't just emotional, it was financial. She'd been funding her affair using the money I worked to earn, the money meant for our future. The anger I'd been holding back surged forward, red-hot and undeniable. The jewelry purchase stuck in my mind like a splinter, its presence impossible to ignore. Ella and I hadn't exchanged gifts in months, maybe even years, beyond the obligatory birthday or holiday gestures. But this wasn't for me. It wasn't for us. I sat at the dining table with the evidence spread out before me. Bank statements, printouts of transactions, and the growing weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. It wasn't just an affair. It was theft, plain and simple. She'd stolen from the life we'd built together to fuel her lies. By the time Ella returned that evening, my anger had simmered into something sharper, focused, cold. She opened the door cautiously, her eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "Peter," she said softly, her tone carrying a mixture of guilt and apprehension. "We need to talk," I said, gesturing to the seat across from me. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the papers on the table. "What is all this?" "Sit down, Ella," I repeated, my voice steady but firm. Slowly, she lowered herself into the chair, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I picked up one of the statements and slid it across the table. "You want to explain this? The restaurants, the hotels, the jewelry?" Her face paled as she scanned the paper. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and said, "Peter, Don't," I interrupted, my voice rising. "Don't give me another excuse. Don't tell me you didn't mean for this to happen. You didn't just betray me. You used me. You used my trust, my money, to fund this thing with Ian." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't feel sympathy. "Not this time. I know I messed up," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that." "Good," I snapped, "because I sure as hell won't forgive you either." She reached out, but I recoiled, the thought of her touch repulsive in that moment. "Please, Peter," she begged. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just give me a chance to make it right." I shook my head, incredulous. A chance to make it right? After all this? "Ella, you've burned every bridge we had. There's no going back." Her tears fell freely now, but I felt nothing but the numbness of betrayal. "Peter, I love you," she said, her voice breaking. "No," I said coldly. "You don't. If you did, you wouldn't have done this." She sobbed into her hands, but I stood, unable to bear the sight of her. "You should leave," I said, my voice flat. "Not for a night, for good." Ella looked up, her eyes wide and desperate. "Peter, please." But I didn't let her finish. I turned and walked away, leaving her at the table with the evidence of her betrayal laid bare. I heard her cry, heard the scrape of the chair as she stood, but I didn't look back. As the door closed behind her, the weight on my chest lifted slightly. It wasn't relief, exactly, but it was the first step toward freedom. The silence in the house after Ella left wasn't the peaceful kind I'd hoped for. It wasn't the silence of calm or freedom. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of a void. Everything felt sharper without her presence. The ticking of the clock, the creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Each sound reminded me that this was my reality now, a life fractured beyond recognition. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I wandered the house aimlessly, pausing in rooms that suddenly felt like exhibits in a museum of what our life used to be. The photos on the wall mocked me, the smiling couple, the laughter frozen in time, the promises silently etched into every frame. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a box and started packing. The photos came down first, their glass frames cold and unyielding in my hands. I piled them into the box without care, too angry to think about preserving them. Then came the smaller items, the keepsakes, the trinkets from trips we'd taken, the souvenirs of a life that felt more like a dream. I stopped when I came across a small wooden figurine. It was a carved hummingbird, something Ella had bought during our first anniversary trip to the mountains. She'd loved it, claiming it symbolized freedom and beauty. I stared at it, the irony twisting my gut. Freedom. Beauty. What a joke. The box filled quickly, but there was no satisfaction in the task. No catharsis. Just more anger, more grief, more emptiness. By mid-morning, Matt called. I almost didn't answer, but something in me knew I couldn't keep bottling everything up. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Hey man," Matt replied. "How are you holding up?" I hesitated, the truth catching in my throat. "I threw her out," I said finally. There was a pause and then, good. She didn't deserve to stay after everything she's done. Yeah, I muttered, sinking into the couch. Matt sighed on the other end of the line. You know, this isn't the end of the world. It feels like it now, but it's not. You're going to get through this. I don't know if I even want to, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Hey, Matt said sharply, don't go there. You're stronger than this. You just don't see it yet. I didn't respond, my eyes fixed on the hummingbird figurine still sitting on the coffee table. Listen, Matt continued, his tone softening. Come stay with me for a few days. You don't need to be alone right now. I wanted to argue, to insist that I was fine, but the truth was, I wasn't. The house felt haunted, every corner a reminder of what I'd lost. Okay, I said quietly. By the time I packed a bag and drove to Matt's, I felt a small flicker of relief. Maybe, just maybe, I could start a rebuild. Matt's house was a modest two-bedroom on the outskirts of town, the kind of place I used to tease him about when I visited. Now, it felt like a sanctuary. He greeted me at the door with a grin and a beer, like he always did when I was going through something tough. Welcome to Casa de Matt, he said, motioning me inside. The familiarity was comforting. We stayed up late that night talking about everything except Ella. It was a relief to let my mind drift to lighter things, even if only for a few hours. But the storm couldn't be avoided forever. The next morning, I woke to a text from Ella. We need to talk. Please. I stared at the message for a long time, torn between anger and exhaustion. I knew what she wanted. Another chance to explain herself, to convince me we could fix this. But I wasn't sure there was anything left to save. Matt noticed me staring at my phone. What's she saying? She wants to talk, I said flatly. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. What are you going to do? I didn't know. Part of me wanted to block her number, to shut her out completely. But another part of me, a part one hated, wanted answers. Closure, maybe, or revenge. I'll meet her, I said finally. Matt frowned but didn't argue. Later that day, I found myself sitting across from Ella in a coffee shop. She looked like she hadn't slept, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Thanks for coming, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you want, Ella? I asked, cutting straight to the point. She flinched but didn't back down. I wanted to apologize. Again. And I wanted to tell you that. I'm ending things with Ian. For good. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Why now? Because you got caught? Or because you realized he's not the knight in shining armor you thought he was? Her eyes filled with tears. Because I made a mistake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But I want to make things right. With you. The anger bubbled up again, hot and sharp. You can't just undo this, Ella. You didn't trip and fall into this mess. It was months of lies. Months of choices. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Peter, please, she begged. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I love you. I always have. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You don't get to say that, I said, my voice shaking. Not after everything. Her tears fell freely as I walked out, leaving her sitting alone. The confrontation with Ella left me drained, but also strangely liberated. I had said my piece, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. Back at Matt's house, I threw myself into distractions, cleaning, running, helping him with a project in his backyard. Anything to keep my mind from wandering back to the broken pieces of my life. But the progress was slow. Nights were the hardest, the quiet hours when the doubts crept in, whispering that maybe I was to blame. Maybe I could have done more. One night, as I sat on Matt's couch scrolling aimlessly through my phone, an ad for a local community group caught my eye. It was for a support group for people going through divorces. I hesitated. The thought of sharing my story with strangers felt uncomfortable, but I also knew I couldn't keep leaning on Matt forever. The first meeting was awkward. I introduced myself, shared the basics of my story, and listened as others shared theirs. By the end, I realized I wasn't alone. The betrayal, the anger, the loss, it wasn't unique to me. And somehow, that made it a little easier to bear. Over the next few weeks, I started going regularly. Each session felt like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming a sense of normalcy. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rediscover pieces of myself that had been buried under the weight of my marriage. I threw myself back into running, setting a goal to train for a half marathon. I also reconnected with old friends, people I drifted away from during the years I was so focused on Ella and our life together. One night, Matt and I went out to a local bar, something I hadn't done in years. It felt strange at first, like I was wearing someone else's shoes. But as the night went on, I found myself laughing again, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. It wasn't about meeting someone new or forgetting Ella. It was about remembering who I was before her. One afternoon, months after Ella left, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was from her. Inside, she poured her heart out, apologizing again, recounting her regrets, and begging for another chance. She claimed to have started therapy, to have cut ties with Ian, to be working on herself. But as I read the letter, I realized something important. I didn't feel the pull anymore. The guilt, the doubt, it was gone. Her words were just that, words. They no longer had power over me. I tossed the letter in the trash. By the end of the year, I'd finalized the divorce. It wasn't without its challenges, splitting assets, dealing with paperwork, but it felt like closing the door on a chapter of my life that no longer served me. I moved into a new apartment across town, one that I furnished myself. It was small, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly starting over. A year after Ella's confession, I crossed the finish line of my first half marathon. The cheers of the crowd, the pounding of my heart, it was exhilarating. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Ella became a distant memory, a lesson learned the hard way. And as I looked toward the future, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I was free.